The dust cloud on the horizon announced trouble long before Magdalena's wagon wheels creaked to a halt outside the weathered gates of the Double Cross Ranch. Jake, iron hand, Morrison watched from his porch, the leather of his worn chaps groaning as he shifted his weight against the wooden rail. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of Apache steel and a younger man's recklessness. She stepped down from the wagon with the grace of a wild cat, her dark hair catching the desert wind like silk ribbons in a storm. Magdalena Vasquez wasn't what he'd expected when the telegram arrived 3 days prior, announcing the arrival of his late brother's widow. The black mourning dress clung to curves that spoke of forbidden promises, and when she lifted her veil, eyes the color of midnight met his with an intensity that made his chest tighten like a lasso around a wild mustang. "Senor Morrison," her voice carried the musical cadence of her Mexican heritage, each syllable rolling off her tongue like honey from a broken comb. "I am grateful for your hospitality in my time of need." Jake descended the steps slowly, his spurs singing a metallic song against the worn wood. The scent of leather and horse sweat clung to him like a second skin, mixing with the sage and dust that defined this harsh land. He'd built this ranch with his bare hands, carved it from the unforgiving desert through sheer will and the strength of his back. Women were a luxury he couldn't afford, until now. "Ma'am," he touched the brim of his hat, noting how her eyes lingered on the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. "Your husband spoke of you often. Said you were spirited." A ghost of a smile played at the corners of her full lips. "Miguel had many words for me, senor. Not all of them kind." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the jasmine in her hair, see the way her chest rose and fell beneath the confines of her bodice. "I hope you will find me more agreeable." The word hung between them like smoke from a campfire, heavy with implications that made Jake's jaw clench. He'd known plenty of women in his 35 years, saloon girls with painted faces and empty promises, settlers' daughters who looked at him like he was salvation wrapped in denim and leather. But this one was different. This one looked at him like she knew exactly what kind of man he was beneath the civilized veneer, and she wasn't afraid. "Your room's upstairs," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Second door on the right. Supper's at 6. As she gathered her skirts to climb the porch steps, her hand brushed against his arm, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, if not for the way her fingers lingered just a heartbeat too long. The contact sent electricity through his veins like lightning across a summer sky. "Gracias," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear as she passed. "I have a feeling my stay here will be very educational." Jake watched her disappear into the house, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The Double Cross Ranch had always been his sanctuary, his kingdom carved from dust and determination. But as the screen door closed behind Magdalena Vasquez, he had the unsettling feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to be turned upside down. The evening wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of storms to come. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that echoed the sudden ache in Jake's chest. He'd buried his brother just 3 months ago, and now Miguel's widow had arrived like a beautiful curse, bringing with her secrets that glittered in her dark eyes like stars in a midnight sky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold, Jake Morrison stood alone on his porch and wondered if he'd just welcomed salvation or damnation into his home. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, its deep resonance echoing through the ranch house like a heartbeat. Jake had changed into his best shirt, a crisp white cotton that emphasized the bronze of his skin and the breadth of his shoulders. His dark hair, still damp from washing, curled slightly at the collar, and he'd taken extra care shaving around the scar that marked him as a man who'd faced death and lived to tell about it. Magdalena descended the stairs like a vision from a fever dream. She traded her morning dress for something that made Jake's mouth go dry, a deep burgundy gown that hugged her waist before flowing over her hips like water over river stones. The neckline was modest by Eastern standards but scandalous enough to make a cowboy's imagination run wild as mustangs across the plains. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her fingers trailing along the banister as she moved. "I found this in my trunk." Miguel bought it for me in Santa Fe, but I never had occasion to wear it. Jake's throat worked as he swallowed hard. It's fitting for the occasion. The dining room table, usually set for one, now held two place settings with his mother's good china, plates that hadn't seen use since her funeral 5 years prior. Candles flickered in the evening breeze that drifted through the open windows, casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. "You cook as well as you ranch?" Magdalena asked, settling into her chair with fluid grace. The movement caused her dress to shift, revealing a glimpse of ankle that made Jake's pulse quicken like a racehorse at the starting gate. "A man learns to fend for himself out here," he replied, serving the beef stew he'd prepared with more care than usual. "The nearest town's a hard day's ride, and hired help doesn't always stick around." She took a delicate bite, her lips closing around the spoon in a way that made Jake shift uncomfortably in his chair. She hummed, the sound vibrating through him like the low notes of a church organ. "You have many talents, Senor Morrison." "Jake," he corrected, his voice rougher than the bark on an old oak. "We're family now after a fashion." Her eyes met his across the table, dark and fathomless as a midnight pool. "See, family." The way she said it made the word sound like both a promise and a threat. "Tell me, Jake, do you ever get lonely out here? All this land, all this space with no one to share it with?" The question hung between them like smoke from a branding iron. Jake set down his fork, his calloused hands flat on the table. "A man makes his peace with solitude. It's better than the alternative." "And what alternative is that?" "Letting someone close enough to hurt you." Magdalena leaned forward slightly, the candlelight catching the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Perhaps the hurt is worth the pleasure that comes before it." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no clouds marred the star-filled sky. The storm was coming from within the house, building between them with each loaded glance, each carefully chosen word. Jake felt like a man standing in a field during a lightning storm, knowing he should seek shelter but unable to move. "Miguel wrote to me about you," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that made him lean closer despite himself. "He said you were the strongest man he knew but also the loneliest. He worried about you, out here with nothing but cattle and memories for company." "Miguel talked too much," Jake muttered, but there was no real anger in his voice. "He said you blamed yourself for what happened to your wife." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, making him push back from the table so hard his chair scraped against the floor. "That's enough." But Magdalena wasn't deterred. She rose gracefully, moving around the table until she stood beside his chair. Her hand settled on his shoulder, fingers tracing the tense muscles beneath his shirt. "He also said you were the most honorable man he'd ever known. That you'd die before you dishonor a woman under your protection." Jake's breath came in short, sharp bursts as her touch burned through the cotton like a brand. "What are you doing, Magdalena?" "I'm trying to understand the man who's opened his home to me," she whispered, her lips so close to his ear that he could feel the warmth of her breath. "The man who looks at me like I'm both his salvation and his damnation." He turned in his chair, catching her wrist in his large hand. Her pulse fluttered beneath his thumb like a trapped bird. "You're playing with fire, woman?" A smile curved her lips, mysterious and knowing. "Perhaps I want to get burned." The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain against the windows and filling the house with the sound of nature's fury. Jake lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling as lightning illuminated his room in stark, white flashes. Sleep eluded him like a wild horse refusing the bridle, his mind replaying every moment of the evening. The way Magdalena's dress had clung to her curves, the heat of her touch on his shoulder, the promise in her dark eyes. A soft knock at his door made him bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like a woodpecker on dead oak. "Jake." Her voice was barely audible above the storm, trembling with something that might have been fear or anticipation. He pulled on his pants and opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, wrapped in a silk robe that did little to conceal the nightgown beneath. Her hair fell in dark waves over her shoulders, and her feet were bare against the cold wooden floor. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, her eyes wide and vulnerable in the lamplight. "The storm? It reminds me of the night Miguel died." The thunder sounds like gunshots and I... She broke off, wrapping her arms around herself as a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward, his hands settling on her shoulders to steady her. The silk of her robe was warm from her skin, and he could feel her trembling beneath his touch. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "Nothing's going to hurt you while you're under my roof." She looked up at him, her face tilted toward his like a flower seeking the sun. "I know," she breathed. "That's what frightens me. Magdalena. Do you know what my name means, Jake?" She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, smell the jasmine that seemed to cling to her skin like morning dew. "It means, woman of Magdala. The repentant sinner. The one who was forgiven much because she loved much." His hands tightened on her shoulders, his resolve cracking like ice in spring. "You should go back to your room." "Should I?" Her hand came up to rest against his bare chest, her palm flat over his heart. "Or should I stay and confess my sins to you? Would you make me kneel, Jake? Would you make me beg for forgiveness?" The words hit him like a physical blow, sending heat racing through his veins like wildfire across dry grass. He'd been fighting his desire for her since the moment she'd stepped down from that wagon, but now, with her standing so close he could count her eyelashes, his control was slipping like sand through his fingers. "You don't know what you're asking," he growled, his voice barely human. "Don't I?" She rose on her tiptoes, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "I've been watching you, Jake Morrison. The way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. The way your hands clench when I'm near. You want me as much as I want you." Lightning flashed again, illuminating them both in stark relief. The rugged cowboy and the beautiful widow, caught in a moment that would change everything. Jake's resistance finally shattered like glass against stone. "God help me," he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, claiming her lips with a hunger that had been building since the moment she'd arrived. She melted against him, her body soft and pliant as he backed her against the wall, his hands tangling in her hair. The kiss was everything he'd imagined and more. Fire and silk, passion and promise. She tasted like wine and sin, like everything he'd ever wanted but never dared to reach for. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their hearts racing like horses at full gallop. "This is wrong," he said even as his hands refused to release her. "Is it?" She looked up at him with eyes that held no regret, only desire. "Miguel is dead, Jake. I'm free to choose my own path now. And I choose you." Thunder crashed overhead as if the very heavens were protesting their union. But Jake was beyond caring about propriety or consequences. This woman had awakened something in him that he'd thought buried with his wife. A hunger that went beyond the physical, a need that consumed him like fever. "If we do this," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper, "there's no going back. I'm not a gentle man, Magdalena. I've been alone too long, wanted too much." She smiled, slow and seductive as a cat in cream. "I'm not asking for gentle, cowboy. I'm asking for real." Dawn broke over the Double Cross Ranch like a promise kept, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jake stood at his bedroom window, watching the sun chase away the shadows of the storm, his body still humming with the memory of the night before. Magdalena lay sleeping in his bed, her dark hair spread across his pillow like spilled ink, the sheet barely covering the curves that had driven him to madness. She'd been everything he'd imagined and more. Fire and silk, passion and surrender. She'd knelt before him not in submission but in power, her dark eyes holding his as she'd worshipped him with a devotion that had brought him to his knees in return. They'd moved together like dancers in an ancient ritual, their bodies speaking a language older than words, older than civilization itself. "You're thinking too hard," her voice, husky with sleep and satisfaction, made him turn from the window. She'd propped herself up on one elbow, the sheet slipping to reveal the golden skin of her shoulder, marked with the evidence of his passion. "Regrets already?" he asked, though his heart clenched at the possibility. She laughed, a sound like silver bells in the morning breeze. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to seduce you properly." She stretched like a cat, the movement causing the sheet to slip further, revealing the swell of her breast. "Come back to bed, cowboy. The day can wait." But Jake remained at the window, his jaw tight with tension that had nothing to do with desire. "We need to talk, Magdalena. About Miguel. About why you're really here." Something flickered in her eyes, a shadow that was there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "What do you mean? Miguel didn't die in a riding accident, did he?" The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Finally, Magdalena sat up, pulling the sheet around herself like armor. "How did you know?" "Because I knew my brother. He was the best horseman in 3 counties. It would take more than a spooked horse to kill him." Jake turned to face her fully, his expression hard as granite. "Who was he, Magdalena? The man you were running from?" She closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as if a great weight had settled on them. "His name was Don Carlos Mendoza. A wealthy landowner from Mexico. He claimed I belonged to him. Said my father had promised me to him before he died. And Miguel helped you escape. See." Tears glittered in her dark eyes like diamonds. "We met at a cantina in El Paso. I was desperate and he was kind. He offered to marry me to give me his name and protection. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we could get far enough away." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "But Mendoza found you. 3 months ago. Miguel tried to protect me, but Carlos had men with him. Good men with guns." Her voice broke on the words. "They made me watch while they killed him. Then Carlos told me I had 3 days to mourn my mistake, before I would return with him to Mexico. But you didn't go." "I ran. Again." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "I came here because Miguel told me about you. He said you were the only man he knew who was strong enough to stand against Carlos, honorable enough to protect a woman who wasn't even really his family." Jake moved to the bed, sitting on the edge as he reached for her hands. They were trembling, cold despite the warmth of the morning. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Carlos is patient when it suits him, but he doesn't like to be denied. He'll come, Jake. And when he does, he'll find me waiting." Jake's voice was steel wrapped in velvet, deadly calm. "This is my land, Magdalena. My home. And you're under my protection now." She searched his face, looking for doubt or fear and finding neither. "You don't understand. He has money, influence. He can buy men, buy justice itself." "Maybe." Jake's thumb traced over her knuckles, a gentle touch that contrasted with the hardness in his eyes. "But he can't buy me. And he sure as hell can't take what's mine." "Yours?" The word was barely a whisper. "Mine," he confirmed, his voice rough with possession and promise. "Last night changed everything, Magdalena. You're not just Miguel's widow anymore. You're my woman now, and I protect what's mine." She threw herself into his arms then, her body shaking with relief and something deeper. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered against his neck. "I came here for protection, not for this. Sometimes the best things happen when we're not looking for them." He held her close, breathing in the scent of jasmine and woman that was uniquely hers. "We'll face whatever comes together. Carlos Mendoza can bring all the men and money he wants. He'll find out what happens when you threaten a Morrison's family." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of the storm. In the distance, a hawk circled on the thermals, its cry echoing across the vast expanse of the Double Cross Ranch. It was a sound of freedom, of wildness that couldn't be tamed or bought. Jake Morrison had built his empire from dust and determination, carved his place in this harsh land through strength and will. He'd lost one woman to violence and vowed never to risk his heart again. But as he held Magdalena in his arms, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, he knew that some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth dying for. The rancher had indeed put her on her knees to confess her sins. But in the end, she had become his greatest sin, and his salvation. Whatever storm was coming, they would weather it together, 2 souls bound by passion and protected by the unforgiving strength of the American West. The confession was complete. Now came the reckoning.